Russia in the late summer of 1942 was poised on the edge of an abyss. German troops had swept across the Russian steppe in a seemingly unstoppable wave of technologically advanced tanks, warplanes, and highly trained and equipped soldiers. German motivation was strong, as Hitler had convinced his men that the Russians had been ready to strike into Germany. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, was therefore regarded by the Wehrmacht soldiers as a pre-emptive strike to protect the fatherland, a European crusade against Bolshevism. Moscow and Leningrad were in danger of being crushed by the German armies in a lethal embrace. But these towns were simply the prelude to battlefield glory. Hitler soon became anxious to claim his most prestigious objective, the town that bore Stalin's name, which would soon be within the aim of the German tank sites. In disbelief and fear, the world watched another blitzkrieg campaign unfold, this time to consume the vast Russian hinterland with apparent ease. As the great war machine sped eastwards towards the river Volga and town of Stalingrad, who could possibly imagine that the town would become synonymous with unspeakable misery, brutality, and violence on a scale never envisaged even under the tyranny of Hitler and Stalin? But appearances were deceptive, and all was not proceeding as planned during Operation Blue, the advance towards the Caucasus oil fields. Access to these oil fields was vital to enable Hitler to continue reaching out for total domination of Europe, as Germany did not possess sufficient reserves to prosecute a modern war on the immense scale that Hitler planned in his yearning for Lebensraum. The army that had sped over Russian territory was so vast that it had initially been divided into three: Army Groups North, Center, and South. Two subgroups then evolved, Army Group A and Army Group B. It was Army Group B that was to press towards Stalingrad and bring Hitler the symbolic defeat of Stalin that meant more to him than the lives of 350,000 men. Two principal German formations had been designated the task of capturing the city: the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army. The 6th Army was a highly efficient fighting force, commanded by a man whose name carries a legacy of controversy to this day, many years after his death: General Friedrich von Paulus. Paulus had been promoted to the command of the 6th Army by the unexpected death of General Reichenau, his predecessor, killed in an air crash on his way to Berlin. A very good staff officer, Paulus lacked experience in the field. He had never even commanded a division, let alone a huge organization such as the 6th Army. But for the seeming invincibility of the German forces, and Hitler's expectation that the thrust eastwards would prove the easy superiority of German forces over the subhuman Soviets, he would not have been a likely choice for the command. Nonetheless, the man who was to lead the 6th Army into the furnace at Stalingrad launched his new command with a victory over the Soviets near the River Don. Confidence was high, but as usual, the pace of advance was too slow for the Führer. Despite launching the invasion of Russia with almost 4 million men under arms, despite huge numbers of Russian prisoners and captured weapons, the German forces were being dangerously stretched by the enormous distances they needed to travel. Supply lines began to fail, so that reserves of oil and spare parts dropped to worryingly low levels. The momentum of the German campaign began to falter. Troops from Romania, Hungary, and Italy proved to be points of weakness in the German front lines. The Romanians especially fighting in a war in which they had no interest, were blamed for many of the problems that engulfed the soldiers at Stalingrad. Lacking the training and equipment of their German allies, these unfortunate men were cruelly beaten, even hanged by their officers for disciplinary failings. It is no wonder that their defenses collapsed easily in the face of terrifying Russian onslaughts. In the opinion of Field Marshal von Rundstedt, they were completely unprepared for warfare on the Eastern Front. Far worse, however, were the problems caused by the Führer's military inadequacy, already beginning to manifest themselves now that difficult decisions needed to be taken, and those ever more frequently. Hitler repeatedly changed his mind. Lost in designing grandiose plans, he had failed to attend to the essential practicalities of large-scale war. His failings were circling like vultures over the entire Russian enterprise. Impatient to get to the oil fields of the Caucasus, he now made a fatal mistake. He decided to split the forces advancing eastward on Stalingrad into two entities. Holt's 4th Panzer Army was siphoned off to hasten the push to the south. He then withdrew the 40th Panzer Corps from the 6th Army, leaving them to press on alone to the Volga. As a result, the advance was transformed into a slow frontal assault. Increasing Soviet counterattacks began to bite into the speed of the advance. Field Marshal von Bock was angrily frustrated at such a dangerous watering down of forces, and was dealt with in the same peremptory fashion as were all critics of the leadership. Hitler dismissed him and continued to frustrate his commanders through his meddling. To the Russian defenders in the middle of July, however, the German onslaught still looked likely to hit the city of Stalingrad at any time in the near future. By the 24th, Rostov on the River Don had fallen to the German tanks, and a jubilant Hitler was unaware that he was about to send his troops into one of the worst and most bloody nightmares that the Eastern Front had to offer. His refusal to listen to anyone but himself was to turn Stalingrad into a self-replenishing graveyard, tragically renowned for heroic endurance and pitiless savagery. Towards the end of July, in stifling temperatures of 53 degrees and choking dust clouds, von Paulus and the German 6th Army were steadily approaching the River Don west of Stalingrad, and Stalin nervously realized that a showdown was imminent. The Soviet forces retreating before the 6th Army were facing disintegration. If Paulus were to reach the Volga in force, the country would be split in two. Hitler would have reached his goal. Stalin issued his notorious Order Number 227, often referred to as "not one step back." Anyone who surrendered was now labeled a traitor to the motherland, and special detachments were formed who would follow the initial line of attacking troops and combat cowardice and desertion by shooting any soldiers who showed signs of hesitating. But there were very few Russian survivors of the German offensives. With Richthofen's Stukas overhead, some troops, such as the 13,000 men of the 181st Rifle Division, were wiped out by the German advance. Only 105 escaped back across the River Don. As the situation became more desperate for Stalin, a man who was to become a legend in Russia arrived at the Stalingrad front headquarters on the 16th of July. His name was Vasily Chukov, one of the most ruthless of a new breed of Soviet commander, determined to avenge and reverse the Red Army's humiliations. His 64th Army was now to bear the brunt of the German advance, which, by mid-July, was embroiled in terrifying battles with the Red Army. Messerschmitt 109s tore through the skies, engaged in vicious dogfights with the Soviet star fighter pilots, now beginning to gain respect on both sides for their skills. On the ground, the German tanks had made a similar experience, with the realization that the Russian T-34 was virtually impenetrable from a distance. Their weakness was more human than technical. It lay in the appalling lack of tactical ability displayed by commanders, and, to Zhukov's dismay, the total failure of the tank and aviation arms to coordinate their efforts. Soon, General von Richthofen was noting that Russian forces were pouring towards Stalingrad from all directions. And whilst the German soldiers, their morale beginning to waver in the face of increased casualties from the Red Army assaults, looked forward to reaching the town and catching up on their leave, the moment of no return was fast approaching. Hitler chose this moment to once again reverse his orders to the 4th Panzer Army and sent them back towards Stalingrad. It was too late for such a futile gesture. By weakening the initial attack, Hitler had allowed the Soviet forces to stave off the final assault on Stalingrad just long enough to organize its defenses. On August the 21st, General von Seydlitz sent his men across the River Don. Nothing now lay between them and the city on the Volga except open steppe. At dawn on the 22nd, they began their historic advance. At this vital stage in the operation, Paulus took one of the most controversial decisions that was made during the entire invasion of Russia. He halted the advance of the 6th Army in order to regroup. Whilst Paulus's troops were stationary, the Russians were also regrouping. Stalin had appointed Marshal Zhukov as Deputy Supreme Commander with absolute control of Stalingrad operations. His merciless command had saved Leningrad during the first siege winter. Now he was to do the same for Stalingrad. Army Group B headquarters were urging Paulus to move on, but when he did so, his advantage had been squandered. The Red Army defenders had escaped the sweeping German pincer attack out on the steppe and were now inside the city. August the 23rd was the day that Stalingrad's nightmare exploded into bloody reality. Richthofen, commander of the 4th Air Fleet, was in the sky once more, this time with some 1,200 Luftwaffe aircraft. Squadrons of Junkers 88 and Heinkel 111 bombers, supported by Stukas, lifted into the warm air and closed together into waves as they headed towards Stalingrad. In the city, the air raid warning screeched, anti-aircraft batteries opened up, and with people scrambling for cover, Richthofen's planes began their attack. They delivered a never-ending blanket of bombs into the terrified inhabitants of the city. Nothing and no one was spared. The ceaseless bombing over Stalingrad killed more than 40,000 during the first week. On the ground, the swift panzer advance had thrown the Red Army troops into chaos. Nonetheless, the ferocious Soviet resistance had managed to stagger parts of the German attack, and Russian artillery continued to exact a steady toll of German armor. Despite linking up with the 4th Panzer Army at the beginning of September, problems in the 6th Army that Hitler had chosen to ignore now began to intensify. What no one foresaw, once Hitler had ordered a full-scale assault on Stalingrad, was that the bombing, which had seemed so impressive during the previous weeks, had caused a major problem. In the desert of rubble littering the streets and open spaces that had once been the city of which its inhabitants were so proud, no tank could pass unseen, no storm assault could now take place. The Germans had discarded their advantage of blitzkrieg war. Once the German forces entered the town, merciless street fighting was the only option left. Frustrated at the lack of progress towards the Caucasus in the south, Hitler became ever more determined to take Stalingrad whatever the cost. Stalin was equally determined to hold it whatever the cost. General Zhukov understood the implications of his command perfectly. Hold the city or die in the attempt. Here, especially in the north, they were confronted with fierce resistance, and the first doubts that the Russian forces were all but crushed began to arise. The intense bombing had done nothing to break the Russians' will to resist, even though they were pinned back against the Volga as German troops closed in from all sides. As the Germans pressed on into the city, the fighting had already taken on the horrific pattern for which Stalingrad became notorious. The factories and landmarks became the focal points for bloody hand-to-hand fighting. Names that now have dreadful associations with pitiless assaults, death and destruction. The Red October steelworks, the tractor factory, the railway stations, the Lazur chemical plant, the Unimag department store. The main station changed hands 15 times in 5 days. The ground was churned by shells that covered and uncovered mangled corpses in a grisly spectacle reminiscent of the trenches of World War I. The fighting began to close in on itself, battles taking place for a single room, for control of a flight of stairs, for the corner of a building, a shell crater. The Rats' War had begun, and the Germans, so confident a week before, were now submerged in a hell of their own making. Men were pitched into hand-to-hand fighting, often taking each other to death simultaneously with bayonets, their corpses then disintegrating in the artillery and bombing raids that went on around them. Pilots could hardly tell who was friend and who was foe in the chaos beneath them. Zhukov had ordered that his front lines should never be more than 50 yards from the Germans, with the consequence that the German artillery shelled its own front lines. Russian snipers were also an ever-present menace to the incautious, for the ruined city provided a wealth of excellent hideouts. Although General Rodimtsev took great pride in the marksmanship of his soldiers, claiming that each guardsman shot like a sniper, it is the name of Vasily Zaitsev that is inextricably linked with Stalingrad, where he became the most famous sniper of his day. But a famous duel between Zaitsev and an SS major appears to have been Russian propaganda. No SS units were deployed during the battle at Stalingrad. Deprived of food, and also fresh water since the destruction of the water pumping station in August, the suffering of the civilians who remained in the city, children amongst them, was intense. Russian snipers shot without mercy any children who, for a crust of bread, attempted to fill water bottles for German soldiers or retrieve the German corpses. For their part, the Germans shot anyone found trying to get grain from the burned-out grain elevator. As September gave way to October, German attacks intensified still further and helped to increase enemy occupation of the city to 70%. The Russians, crushed up against the banks of the Volga, were holding on, desperately fighting for every inch of ground. The infamous Katyusha rocket launchers were still operating from the east bank of the Volga, hurling their salvos of 5-foot-long rockets into the German lines. From the West Bank, the massed Soviet artillery continued to hammer the German lines of communication and directed ferocious bombardments into any troops that appeared to be gathering for an attack. Russian commanders, however, soon realized that the machine gun and the hand grenade were the most essential weapons in the nightmare world that Stalingrad had become. But without the inspirational, if ruthless, example of Zhukov, commanding from the thick of the fighting, keeping hopes alive when all seemed lost, the story of Stalingrad, and therefore the entire Eastern Front, may have been very different. The ferries brought just enough food and ammunition to continue the defense of the city. But as the October days passed, the fate of the Russians seemed to be inescapable. German troops had smashed forward as a consequence of repeated assaults and moved to within yards of the river. Their morale had been crushed, and the cemeteries behind the lines increased in size daily, but their discipline was exemplary. Stalin and Hitler were exerting intense pressure on their respective commanders, Zhukov and von Paulus, to end the deadlock at Stalingrad. A sudden hiatus in the fighting led Zhukov to suspect, rightly, that a major operation was being planned by the Germans. It erupted onto the city on the morning of the 14th of October, with the sky darkened by aircraft, including every available Stuka from General von Richthofen's 4th Air Fleet. Stalingrad was submerged in artillery shells, mortars, Nebelwerfer rockets and bombs, falling in quantities never seen before. Tanks moved across the mounds of rubble, firing at point-blank range, and the fighting surged in a renewed rampage of killing above and below the ground of the desecrated city. The Luftwaffe was never out of the air as the Stukas dived in never-ending relays. It was incomprehensible how anyone could have survived, and yet the Russians were still alive in the chaos of mangled steel girders, wrecks, heaving earth and bricks, and still combating every attack. The German troops pressed on, taking ground meter by meter, forcing the Soviets ever closer to the Volga. Despite this relentless attrition, October came to an end without the fall of Stalingrad and the end of misery. November arrived, and with the failure of the final attack on the Red October factory on the 1st, the offensive broke down through sheer exhaustion and lack of ammunition. Hitler boasted in a speech that the city was as good as taken anyway, displaying breathtaking hypocrisy by pretending that he didn't want a second Verdun. One day after his speech, the deadly Russian winter descended to engulf the men. The temperature fell to -18 degrees, and the Volga began to clog with groaning ice floes. The German army had not expected that winter would find them static and still fighting in Russian territory. Whilst the Russians were issued with thick woolen greatcoats, fur hats and felt boots, so that their feet were protected from the snow, the Germans were left with their summer uniforms and nothing but normal greatcoats as protection against the fierce cold. Neither was there finely manufactured equipment made to cope with icy conditions. Tanks had to be warmed by building fires beneath them before they could be started. One of the wisest decisions Stalin ever made was to place all his military production facilities behind the Urals once the German onslaught in Russia took hold. There, out of immediate reach of German forces, the industrial factories had built up their reserves and were now beginning to produce weapons on the scale necessary to seriously threaten German antagonism. By the end of the year, more than 2,200 tanks were pouring from the Russian factories, parallel to 15,500 planes during the final 6 months. Hitler's refusal to believe that Russian factories were outpacing the Germans was a lethal handicap. Red Army units were reduced to mere handfuls of men, defending the last yards to the petrol factories on the banks of the Volga, where Chukov's headquarters were now perched. The Soviets kept up their desperate defensive actions with 30 rounds for each rifle and machine gun, and less than 50 grams of bread per day. In the wake of heavy snowfalls came freezing winds. Unknown to the Germans, the Russians had planned a massive counterattack that was to sound the death knell for the Sixth Army, and with it, the entire thrust of the German campaign in southern Russia. The razor edge of the offensive was to be directed against the front-line positions around Stalingrad, which were now nothing more than a thread held together by Romanians, Italians and Hungarians. Aware of this weakness, the Soviet authorities planned to take full advantage of the situation with a monumental counterattack against these German allies. When the Red Army attack came, the German flanks were perilously undermanned. The ambitious plan to gather forces out on the steppe at the German flanks was the brainchild of Zhukov, who at first had to overcome the skepticism of Stalin. To Stalin's credit, another of his advantages over Hitler was his willingness to listen to seasoned commanders and act on their advice. Zhukov's single-minded, ruthless pursuit of an objective and his exemplary planning and implementation skills impressed his leader. Stalin was eventually persuaded and agreed to a plan that was to turn imminent defeat for the Red Army into a spectacular and uniquely crushing blow for the Wehrmacht. Relentlessly, Soviet men, horses and armaments crossed the Volga under cover of night to reinforce the 3 prongs of the planned attack. For the first time, the air forces and ground troops were coordinating in a methodical manner. Signals intelligence and reconnaissance were working well, and after the fall of snow, white camouflage suits were issued. Raiding parties took prisoners for interrogation, and despite the postponement of the attack for 10 days, the Germans were still unaware of the magnitude of what was about to happen. Soviet secrecy and diversionary activities had worked better than expected. Along the whole front, there are no major changes, was the curt report from 6th Army on the eve of the battle. With the early morning of November the 19th came the launch of Operation Uranus, the Soviet offensive. An appalling chain of human agony was unleashed. At 5:30 a.m., some 3,500 artillery pieces, Katyushas, howitzers and mortars opened fire along the sector chosen for the 2 main northern thrusts. The snow and mud were churned and smashed, and after 1 hour, as the bombardment was retargeted at the second rows of defensive lines, rifle divisions and T-34 tanks appeared over the frozen steppe. 1 million Soviets were taking the fight to the Germans. German panzers were confronted by the Soviets advancing out of the darkness, whilst their own tanks suffered electrical failures and the narrow tracks were unable to grip on the ice. Here was another disaster in the making. The Romanians fought bravely with the equipment that was available to them, even managing to repel several Soviet attacks. but inevitably they were eventually unable to stem the tide. Only at 9:45 was 6th Army headquarters informed of the onslaught. The afternoon of the same day saw Soviet T-34s advancing southwards. With snow and blizzard conditions preventing the Luftwaffe from effective bombing runs, and darkness setting in at about 3:30, the fighting continued in the dark in chaotic conditions. Yet astoundingly, von Paulus did not react. This was perhaps his greatest and most damaging failure as commander of the 6th Army. Effective defense against the Soviet attack would have required Paulus to disobey the Führer's orders, and this he could never bring himself to do. Had he removed men from Stalingrad to meet the incoming threat, the 6th Army may have had a very different story to tell. The fighting in the town was allowed to continue unabated, whilst the debacle out on the steppe unfolded. Not until 10 p.m. that night was the order given for operations within the town to cease, although Zhukov had launched large-scale attacks to prevent the Germans from disengaging. Hitler's insistence on controlling all actions had produced a situation that made swift response impossible. Von Paulus waited for orders. The results were catastrophic. On the 20th, following the Russian Katyusha bombardments, massed waves of Soviet armor and men swept away the Romanian positions south of Stalingrad. All along the line, the Soviets penetrated ever deeper into German-held territory. Toiling under a pitiful lack of accurate information, von Paulus and Schmidt were still optimistic one day later that reinforcements could stabilize the situation, and consulted with Hoth, failing to see that a gigantic trap had been set. The Russians were going to attempt complete encirclement. On Sunday the 22nd, the Russian vanguards sped across the steppe towards each other from the north and south and joined forces. These scenes were later reenacted for the Soviet newsreels. The speed and intensity of the attack stunned the Germans. Stalingrad was encircled. There began a retreat towards the stricken city, unmatched in chaotic horror. With barely enough food to get through a week, 300,000 men were slowly being herded together. Although encirclements had happened before, and the men initially thought that they would be relieved, many officers were aware that without sufficient reserves, rescue was difficult, perhaps even unlikely. Snow whipped across their faces as they passed burnt-out vehicles and struggled to cross the Don River. Some men attempted to cross the ice and crashed through the weaker sections to be plunged to their deaths in the icy water. Those wounded men who could not walk were left behind in the exodus. No one dared to think about their fate. Their chances of survival were nil. In reply to a message sent to Hitler from Paulus, Hitler had radioed a message back on the 24th. He condemned the army to hold the front line on the Volga under all circumstances, and set out the conditions under which, as he called it, Fortress Stalingrad was to be held. Fanaticism and delusion had completely replaced clear military objectivity. Had action been taken, it was perfectly feasible that the situation could have been saved during the initial phase when the Soviet front line was undermanned. It was not to be. In scenes that were soon to be repeated 1,000-fold, columns containing hundreds of German prisoners of war walked out across the snow into captivity. Ragged blankets served as protection in place of greatcoats, string and wire replaced belts. As they were shipped across the river, Russian soldiers remarked sardonically that now the Germans were at last getting to see the Volga. Hitler finally realized that his entire southern Russian front was at risk. He appointed Field Marshal von Manstein to form a new Army Group Don, which included the 6th Army and the units of the 4th Panzer Army also trapped in the pocket. The Luftwaffe had been given the task of supplying the shrinking pocket. Hitler had willingly accepted the impression given by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that this would be possible. The enormity of the problem rendered supplying the pocket under the prevailing circumstances an impossibility. The 6th Army needed at least 700 tons a day. Göring, despite advice that 350 tons a day was the maximum possible, and only for a limited time, then told Hitler that sufficient supplies could be flown in to maintain the 6th Army. A lie that condemned the men to a long, drawn-out death. Based on Göring's assessment, Hitler sent his reply on the 24th. The Volga front was to be held whatever the circumstances. Hitler and reality were rapidly parting company. Zhukov expected an attack to try and relieve the 6th Army, and he was right to do so. Its codename was Operation Winter Storm. The force assembled for the attack was inadequate, almost a half-hearted attempt to be seen to do the right thing. Originally conceived as a two-pronged assault, it was fatally watered down until the success of the entire operation fell on the 4th Panzer Army. This was the main thrust of the attack, supported by the badly shaken Romanian forces that were still available. Even the 17th Panzer Division, which was to support the 4th Panzer Army, was delayed from moving into start positions until 4 days after the counterattack had begun. But Manstein knew something had to be done to help. He worked on the assumption that the mobile elements of the 6th Army would follow his orders to break out of the pocket to the west and link up with the advancing relief troops. A corridor could then be formed, which would enable reinforcements and supplies to pass through to Stalingrad and the injured to be taken out. 4,000 tons of supplies were waiting behind the lines should the attack succeed. On December the 12th, there was a brief artillery bombardment before Holt's panzers started out alone into the snow towards Stalingrad from the south. Incredibly, by the 19th, Holt's panzers were on their way to achieving the impossible. They had penetrated to within 30 miles of the town, forcing Soviet troops to be disengaged to confront the assault. The fighting escalated. In the pocket itself, the rumors spread like wildfire. Hope that had been crushed for so long was rekindled as the distant sounds of firing confirmed that help was on its way. Grimly, the 6th Army fought on, now certain of relief. Yet Hitler still refused to allow von Paulus to break out to meet the oncoming tanks. He was fanatical in his insistence that no German should leave the city. Paulus only had about 70 tanks and enough fuel to travel 12 miles, not enough to join up with Hoth. And what of the weakened and starving men on foot, the injured? How could they have walked into the blizzards over the ice to freedom when they were hardly able to stand from the effects of frostbite and hunger? As easy prey for the Russian guns, there would have been terrible losses. Faced with Hitler and the overwhelming risk, no one made the decision to break out. The men inside Stalingrad were lost. Little did Hoth realize that another dangerous situation had arisen. The Russians had mounted an offensive from the northwest of Stalingrad, Operation Little Saturn, which within days had overrun the main airfield supplying the pocket. Manstein was aware on the 19th that the Russian assault had crushed even the false hope the relief operation had engendered. Von Paulus was never informed of the situation. Hult received an order on the 23rd of December. He was to withdraw immediately. No reasons were given. As the order was issued to the men and the tanks turned away, each man knew that their comrades in Stalingrad had been abandoned. Yet their comrades still fought and inflicted casualties and tank losses on the Russians in a feat of incredible tenacity and determination, facing hopeless odds and almost certain death. This is what made the Stalingrad episode a military legend. Red Army control was now absolute. The Volga had finally frozen solid, and transports were possible, ensuring that food and ammunition suddenly became available in quantities only dreamt of until then. Some 35,000 vehicles crossed over during the next 7 weeks. For the German soldiers, the Stalingrad nightmare became a savage fight with nature to stay alive. Frostbite turned the flesh of the hands or feet black. Men began to die for no apparent reason. None of the doctors dared report that starvation could be the cause. Rations had been reduced still further. Half an ounce of sugar and a couple of ounces of bread per day. The men were infested with lice, dying from typhus and dysentery. Flights into the pocket decreased, whilst Göring still maintained to Hitler's face that supplies were adequate. Hitler's New Year message, promising a glorious victory the like of which had never been seen, showed what state his mind was in, although the war still had 2 years to run its course. The men's minds were as numb as their bodies, filled with delusions from lack of sleep or food, and dulled by the bitter cold and the horrors of bloody death and injury they had seen and endured. The Russians launched what was intended to be the final assault to clear out the pocket. Katyusha rockets screamed across the Volga. Waves of Red Army soldiers streamed towards the German foxholes. Scenes of slaughter took shape out on the steppe to the west of the town, as weakened men tried to rescue comrades, and those able to fight could hardly pull the gun triggers, so swollen were their hands. The Russians advanced over the snow that was strewn with countless skeletal German corpses. Those that did not die in the shell fire were shot by Russian soldiers thirsty for revenge, yet still they resisted, inflicting casualties of over 26,000 on the Soviet forces of the Don front. On the retreat towards the town, Russian prisoners died as the Germans forced them to do the work of tow horses. At Pitomnik airfield, the chaos was appalling. With bombs falling, men rushed the transport planes, trampling comrades underfoot. When Pitomnik fell, lines of ragged, frozen men, limping, their lips cracked and split, dragged their comrades on sleds across the open, icy wastes to Gumrak. Everywhere the suffering was indescribable in its intensity. Death was the only escape brought by the Russian divisions close on their heels. Time and again Germans fought off assaults, only to find that they had been outflanked. The end was approaching fast. When the torn and emaciated men arrived at Gumrak, it was even worse than Pitomnik. Nothing but death and despair awaited them. Soon even Gumrak fell into Russian hands. Only the selfless courage of the Luftwaffe pilots enabled a few supplies to be dropped to the troops now being squeezed towards Stalingrad. The cellars in Stalingrad were overflowing with sick and injured men that some estimates put at around 40,000. The pocket had been split into two, forming a northern and southern encirclement. When the Soviets crashed through into the town, Paulus and Schmidt moved their headquarters to Red Square in the southern pocket. Many officers preferred to commit suicide rather than fall into Russian hands. Others preferred to die fighting, knowing that they would finally be shot anyway. Paulus was reported to be in a deep depression, but still played the hollow game, sending a message to Hitler on the 29th, the eve of the anniversary of the Führer taking power. reporting that the swastika still flew over Stalingrad, maintaining that Germany would finally be victorious. It closed with Heil mein Führer. Next day, Paulus was rewarded. He was made a field marshal. The implication was clear. Hitler intended that he should commit suicide to maintain the pretense of a symbolic victory. German honor would be held upright and proud even in death. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Whatever fate might befall his men, Paulus had no intention of dying. On January the 31st, 1943, he surrendered to the Russians. From holes, cellars and heaps of rubble, the Red Army soldiers gathered well over 90,000 diseased and starving men, the remnants of an army that had thought itself almost invincible a few short months before. In the northern pocket, fighting continued into February the 2nd, until there too the firing stopped and peace returned to the shattered city. The suffering for the captured men was far from over. As their columns trailed away out into the steppe once more on long marches into captivity, they were still uncertain of life. Death at the hands of the Russian soldiers, from exhaustion, starvation or cold, was more likely. Paulus defected. His loyal men were forced to work in mines and labor camps, guarded by Russians who exacted terrible revenge on the soldiers. Some 90,000 went into captivity, and many were still there 13 years later. Most of them never returned to their homes. Only an estimated 6,000 men survived Stalingrad and the Russian labor camps that followed. Two inhuman tyrants had decimated their numbers without thought or compunction. This was a battle that exceeded all concepts of inhumanity. It had not been foreseen, should have been avoided, and provided terrible proof of the corrosive power of an unchecked ego. The carnage of Stalingrad and the deaths it dragged in its wake will remain forever a deep stain in human history.